The U.S. Treasury Department is preparing a significant policy move that could reshape the financial dimension of the Iran conflict. According to a source familiar with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's thinking, the department plans to use Iranian assets to help U.S. Gulf allies recover from damage caused by Tehran during the recent Iran war. If implemented, the move would signal a shift from traditional sanctions enforcement toward direct financial reallocation, using Iranian resources to fund rebuilding efforts in Gulf states affected by the conflict. But key questions remain. Which assets would be used? Under what legal authority? And how could this affect ongoing diplomatic talks? Since late February, when the war broke out, Iran has launched intermittent missile and drone strikes across Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman. The reported Treasury initiative is directly tied to damage resulting from those attacks. According to the source, Secretary Bessent has directed the Treasury Department to seek comprehensive cost estimates from Gulf allies, specifically assessing repair expenses linked to Iranian actions since the conflict began. The department is also evaluating whether Iranian assets could be used to finance repairs for damage already sustained. This suggests two possible financial tracks. First, preparation for potential future damage. Second, compensation for damage already incurred. It remains unclear which Iranian assets would be utilized. The source cited examples that could include Iranian cash held in frozen foreign bank accounts, hard assets such as oil tankers. However, no specific asset pool has been publicly identified. This distinction is important. Frozen cash assets are often tied to sanctions frameworks and international banking systems. Hard assets, by contrast, involve physical property and may present different legal and diplomatic complexities. The Treasury Department has reportedly indicated it intends to use all available authorities to make Iranian assets accessible for rebuilding and repair efforts related to damage inflicted by Tehran. What those authorities specifically entail has not yet been detailed publicly. This financial planning is unfolding amid ongoing indirect peace talks between the United States and Iran. Tehran has insisted that any potential agreement would require lifting sanctions and releasing billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets held abroad. That demand now intersects directly with Treasury's reported planning. If Iranian assets are redirected to Gulf reconstruction efforts, it could complicate negotiations. Iran's position centers on asset release. The Treasury's planning centers on asset utilization for compensation. These are fundamentally different financial outcomes. The potential use of Iranian assets for Gulf rebuilding represents more than a financial mechanism. It signals a broader policy message. If implemented, it would effectively tie Iranian financial resources to the consequences of its military actions during the war. At the same time, the move raises legal, diplomatic, and geopolitical considerations. How would asset redirection align with sanctions law? Could it trigger retaliatory financial measures? Would it influence Iran's negotiating posture? At this stage, the Treasury Department is reportedly in evaluation mode, gathering cost assessments and exploring available legal authorities. No final action has been publicly confirmed. The financial front of the Iran conflict may now be entering a new phase. Rather than focusing solely on sanctions or asset freezes, the U.S. Treasury appears to be considering active reallocation, using Iranian assets to repair damage suffered by Gulf allies during the war. As diplomatic talks continue, the intersection of asset policy and negotiation strategy could become increasingly significant. In Part 2, we examine the legal implications of using frozen assets, how this approach fits within sanctions frameworks, and what it could mean for U.S.-Iran diplomacy moving forward. The Treasury Department's reported planning raises an immediate legal and structural question. Under what authority could Iranian assets be redirected toward Gulf reconstruction? According to the source, Treasury intends to utilize all available authorities to make Iranian assets accessible for rebuilding and repair efforts related to damage inflicted by Tehran. While specific statutes were not detailed in the report, the phrase suggests Treasury is examining existing sanctions frameworks, emergency authorities, and asset control mechanisms already in place. However, asset control and asset transfer are not identical. Freezing funds restricts access. Redirecting or reallocating those funds involves an additional legal step and potentially additional political scrutiny. At this stage, the department is reportedly seeking comprehensive cost estimates from Gulf allies. That step appears to be foundational. Before any financial redirection could occur, a structured accounting of damage would likely be necessary to justify allocation decisions. Since late February, Iran has launched intermittent missile and drone states across Gulf states. The affected countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman, are all long-standing U.S. partners in the region. By requesting detailed repair estimates, Treasury appears to be quantifying the financial consequences of those strikes. This step transforms a geopolitical conflict into a measurable economic ledger. Damage becomes cost. Cost becomes liability. And liability, under certain policy frameworks, can become justification for financial countermeasures. But the timing is notable. The Treasury's planning comes amid ongoing indirect peace talks between the United States and Iran. Tehran has maintained that any future agreement would require lifting sanctions and releasing billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets abroad. That demand directly intersects with the reported Treasury initiative. If Iranian assets are instead allocated toward Gulf reconstruction, the total pool available for sanction relief could effectively shrink, at least temporarily. From Iran's perspective, frozen assets represent leverage in negotiations. From the Treasury's reported position, those same assets may represent a financial tool for compensation. This divergence introduces a new variable into the diplomatic equation. The question of which assets might be used remains unresolved. The source referenced potential examples such as cash held in frozen bank accounts, hard assets like oil tankers. Each category presents different logistical and diplomatic implications. Bank-held funds may be tied to international banking systems and multilateral compliance regimes. Physical assets, such as tankers, involve operational control, valuation, and potentially international maritime considerations. The absence of detail suggests Treasury is still evaluating options rather than executing finalized plans. For Gulf allies, the proposal carries symbolic weight. Using Iranian assets to fund reconstruction would signal direct financial accountability for damage caused during the conflict. It would also reinforce U.S. support for regional partners at a time of heightened security concern. However, such a move could also influence regional dynamics. If implemented, it may be interpreted by Tehran as a continuation of economic pressure during negotiations. Conversely, it could be framed by Washington as a proportional financial response tied specifically to war-related damage. How the policy is communicated may matter as much as how it is executed. At present, the Treasury Department is in an assessment phase. There has been no public announcement of asset seizure or transfer. No specific dollar figures have been disclosed. No timeline has been confirmed. Instead, the report suggests preparation, evaluating authorities, gathering data, and exploring options. That distinction is important. Policy consideration does not equal immediate implementation. The reported Treasury initiative reflects a broader evolution in how economic tools are integrated into geopolitical conflict. Sanctions once focused primarily on restriction. Now, the discussion appears to include reallocation and compensation. As indirect peace talks continue, the financial dimension of the Iran conflict may become increasingly central. The coming weeks may clarify whether this remains a contingency plan or develops into a concrete policy decision. For now, the message is clear. Economic strategy is moving alongside diplomacy, and the outcome could shape both reconstruction efforts in the Gulf and the trajectory of U.S.-Iran negotiations. As the Treasury Department evaluates the potential use of Iranian assets, the broader implications extend beyond reconstruction financing. This move, if implemented, would represent a strategic blending of economic policy and geopolitical accountability. Traditionally, sanctions frameworks aim to restrict access, freezing funds, blocking transactions, limiting trade. But redirecting assets toward rebuilding damage caused by military action introduces a different dimension: financial consequence. In effect, the approach would tie economic resources directly to wartime conduct. That shift carries both symbolic and practical weight. From a diplomatic standpoint, the timing is critical. Indirect peace talks between the United States and Iran are ongoing. Tehran has insisted that sanctions relief, including access to billions of dollars in frozen assets, would be required for any agreement. If Iranian assets are instead allocated toward Gulf reconstruction, it could complicate those negotiations. Iran's negotiating position centers on asset release as a sign of de-escalation. The Treasury's reported planning centers on asset utilization as a response to conflict damage. These frameworks move in opposite directions. Whether they ultimately collide or coexist will depend on how policy evolves in the coming weeks. There is also the question of precedent. If frozen assets are used to compensate regional partners for conflict-related damage, it could establish a template for future disputes involving sanctioned states. Other governments may closely observe how legal authorities are applied, how damages are calculated, and how funds are transferred. Policy tools developed in one conflict often influence future cases. This adds another layer of significance beyond the immediate Gulf recovery effort. For Gulf states, the financial calculus is direct. Missile and drone strikes since late February have reportedly caused damage requiring repair and reconstruction. By requesting detailed cost assessments, Treasury is converting those impacts into quantifiable figures. That process creates a financial record of the conflict's consequences. If Iranian assets are ultimately used to support rebuilding, Gulf allies would see tangible economic backing from Washington, reinforcing long-standing security partnerships. However, this approach may also heighten Tehran's sensitivity to economic measures during negotiations. Balancing accountability and diplomacy will require careful coordination. The global economic environment adds another layer of complexity. Energy markets remain highly responsive to developments in the Gulf region. Investor confidence can shift rapidly amid geopolitical uncertainty. If economic countermeasures escalate alongside diplomatic negotiations, market volatility could increase. At the same time, financial accountability mechanisms could also be framed as stabilizing, demonstrating structured response rather than uncontrolled escalation. How markets interpret the policy will depend on clarity, communication, and implementation. At this stage, the Treasury Department's reported planning remains in evaluation mode. No specific assets have been formally designated. No transfer mechanisms have been announced. No timeline has been disclosed. Instead, what has emerged is a signal. Economic tools are being positioned as part of the broader response to the Iran war. Whether this becomes a formal policy shift will depend on legal review, diplomatic considerations, and strategic calculation. The financial front of the conflict is evolving. As indirect talks continue and reconstruction costs are assessed, Iranian assets, long frozen under sanctions, may become central to the next phase of U.S. policy. The outcome could influence not only Gulf recovery efforts, but also the trajectory of negotiations between Washington and Tehran. For now, the policy remains under consideration, but the message is clear. Economic strategy is no longer operating separately from geopolitical accountability. It is becoming part of it.